So I watched the documentary, and it's titled Jeffrey Epstein, Filthy Rich. And I thought I would check it out and see if it was just drama-filled and something that might be worth giving a miss, or whether it was worth having a watch. I think it's worth watching, even though they have omitted some details that I think are important, like Ghislane Maxwell's connections to Mossad. His father had connections to Mossad, and Jeffrey Epstein has connections to Mossad. And Mossad is like the Israeli version of the CIA. So they lie, cheat, and steal like the CIA, and they kill people and all of that. The CIA has admitted, a former director of the CIA, Mike Pompeo, who's the Secretary of State, he admitted publicly that the CIA learned to lie, cheat, and steal. So anyway, those connections to Mossad are important, and if you watch some of the interviews with Whitney Webb, who's a journalist who was with the Mint Press News, she has her own Twitter page, Whitney Webb, and her podcast is called Unlimited Hangout. So Whitney Webb is writing a book at present. She's done a lot of research into Jeffrey Epstein. So I imagine that a lot of what is missing, and there's a lot missing, of course, she will be covering. It will probably end up being a much more interesting deep dive into Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislane Maxwell, and all the other characters that are involved in this very large global sex trafficking ring, which appears to be a way of extorting leaders and extorting political figures and mainstream media figures, and basically anybody who Jeffrey Epstein and his associates, and obviously higher up people, can use any of these figures that might engage in this sex ring. The young girls that he procures, they can be extorted because they're being photographed and filmed inside Jeffrey Epstein's mansion. I think it's like a $71 million mansion. It's a lot of money, his mansion, which was given to him, I think, by Wexler, who is a billionaire, multi-billionaire. Virginia Giuffre, who is one of the young girls that was groomed by Ghislane Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, and who was basically used as a kind of a sex slave to Jeffrey Epstein. She has said that she believes, and she was with him for a few years, she believes it's a global sex trafficking ring that is intended to, sort of like a honey trap kind of thing, is intended to get as many people that one can extort and manipulate to do what one wishes. Basically, that's the idea, is to just entrap so many people by them being in compromising situations with underage girls, that they can use that to get them to do what they want. So it's a very large, and he was just one part of it, Jeffrey Epstein. My impressions of Jeffrey Epstein himself, in the very small amounts of footage available of him speaking, is that he's a very smart individual. He knows he has this arrogance about him, which Virginia Giuffre said that she believes it's because he thinks that he was almost untouchable because he had so many figures involved. He had so many tentacles out, basically, on so many people, so much that nobody would touch him, basically. And I think that's probably correct, with the kind of arrogance that was shown when he was brought in to for the first, when he was into 2005, when they tried to convict him. He came in a private jet, and he was shaking hands, and he looked totally confident. He didn't seem concerned at all that he might be put away for the rest of his life. Not at all. And of course he wasn't. He wasn't put away for the rest of his life. He was put in a detention center, in a sort of a very cushy sort of a situation where he could actually go out for 12 hours a day, and he had to be back at 8 p.m. at night. This is somebody who's engaged in pedophilia, a pedophile, being allowed to go out every day, and also that he's had underage girls, 50 or so that they know of. And he was given he was given an 18-month sentence, and he was allowed to go out for 12 hours a day. And he did all sorts of things on his times out of the so-called jail sentence. And he would just come back to sleep, basically, in the detention center. And he was let out after 13 months. So basically, it was a little bit of a dint in his usual indulgence in his sexual proclivity, in his pedophilia. It really didn't make much difference to him, and he was totally. And Alex Acosta, who ended up being Trump's labor secretary, he was the one that helped cut the deal for Jeffrey Epstein. And I think because he was let off so easy, it was just a sweetheart deal that his lawyers helped get him. Is because of the fact that there are so many people involved in this sex trafficking ring. So many people involved in it, so many people who are customers of it, that are powerful people, that anybody who had any involvement in it, and there was probably, hundreds or thousands of people, including the people that helped him with this, they didn't want him, obviously, they didn't want him to be in prison, and they were sort of protecting him. And he hadn't become as big a liability as he did later when he finally got caught again. And that's when I think he became a big liability to all those people. And I personally think he was murdered in prison. And it sort of goes into that a little bit. It doesn't sort of say that he was murdered in prison, but it sort of indicates, if you have a look at how anybody could possibly hang themselves in a cell like that, and why the cameras were off during that time, and the guards were asleep, and all that kind of nonsense, really. Such a high-profile prisoner. It's very unlikely, and it's probably more likely that there were so many people wanted him dead at that point because they didn't want him to start singing on them, basically. They didn't want him to reveal anything in a deal, to cut a deal with the FBI or the government. And there are figures, I think, in government that also wanted to see him dead. So basically, when he became too much of a liability, that's when I think they decided to pull the plug on him. I'm sure there's somebody else that's taken over his place and is grooming young girls and probably young boys all over the planet, and feeding the continuation of this sex trafficking ring. But anyway, so I'm wandering off the track. I'm not going to be basically taking it part by part. There's 4 parts that you can see on Netflix, and the various victims/survivors of Jeffrey Epstein give interesting accounts of their time, their sort of harrowing, and it really shows how easy it is to, when young people are so, when they're like between the ages of 12 and 16, or 11 and 16, they are so easily put in situations they don't know what to do. For example, I was explaining what I thought of Jeffrey Epstein. Apparently, he was also a narcissist, and unfortunately, narcissists don't have really any empathy, so he didn't really have any remorse or empathy for what he put those women through. And, oh, that's right, what I was saying about him is that these young people, the story that was told over and over again from these various victims/survivors of Jeffrey Epstein was that, for example, in Florida, where he had a mansion there, and people knew that things were going on, like neighbors could see young women going in there, young girls and whatever. Apparently, each young girl that he would basically ask to give a massage and to pay $200 to them would be asked if they could also recruit some more young girls, and then give them $200 for a massage. And basically, of course, a massage became a sexual assault and of those girls, and totally, the whole thing was inappropriate. He'd either be sexually assaulting them, or various things would occur while he was on this massage table. And sometimes it would be worse than that. Sometimes it would just be, he would just straight out sort of rape one of those girls without any sort of massage thing involved. But he always, these girls didn't know what was happening until it was happening, and the people that recruited them, the young girls, would just say to their friends, "Come along, and he gives you $200 for a massage." And then but then when they were there, they would sometimes have to undress. And every account sounds as if, I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble with one of our little guys is trying to get my attention, and was pulling on my scarf, so I had to stop talking for a moment. Sorry for the interruptions in my train of thought there. So young people would be in a situation where suddenly something really inappropriate is taking place before them, and they really did, because they're so young, they didn't know how to process it and didn't know what to do, and then became frightened. And then they were sort of ended up being recruited that way, kind of like, because often these young girls were also poor or from very, very difficult backgrounds, where broken families and sometimes abusive parents. One of the girls was her stepfather had murdered one of their children, an 8-year-old, right in front of her. And there were so many high schools in West Palm Beach that were in poor areas, and they were just ripe for recruiting these young girls who didn't realize until they were standing in front of the massage table what was going to happen. They thought they might get $200 for a massage. They didn't know it was going to be, they were going to be sexually assaulted, or that there was going to be anything sexual. And so it was just, that's the impression I got from pretty much all those girls, that they were sort of felt like they were completely, it was like it all became very surreal very quickly. And at the same time, Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislane Maxwell, who were sort of partners in crime with this, they all sort of, like Virginia Guffrey, who was with them for a few years, said that it was like this deranged family, where they would sort of go do fun things like diving and skiing and all this kind of stuff, but then she was sort of like a sex slave, basically. So there was this sort of making out like they cared about the girls, and chatting like, how, tell us about yourself and all of that. They were always recruiting certain individuals that would become later on. There was about 4 different women that we know of that basically were probably young girls in that situation, that ended up being probably paid recruiters, actually, sort of as they got beyond the age of 17. They actually became a bit like Ghislane Maxwell, and were doing recruiting as well. And that's probably just the tip of the iceberg. That was probably going on all over the world, where there was even 3 young girls of each 12 years old that were flown in on Jeffrey Epstein's birthday, and they couldn't speak English. They were flown in from France, and then they were flown back to France the next day. And he thought it was he thought it was a great joke. That's a sort of kind of extreme narcissist that he was, that he absolutely had no feelings of empathy for those individuals. And even when they were crying, standing beside the massage table, or obviously in distress, it made no difference to him. So it's all, of course, sexual assault, rape, etc., and pedophilia, it's all about power. It's not really about sex. It's all about power and the thrill of exerting power over the vulnerable, and that power is erotic to those people. I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but anybody who can do that has zero empathy for their victims. And obviously he, because he was they were involved with Mossad and everything, they were protected, because this was a way that powerful people or governments, or in this case the United States government, probably along with the NSA surveillance, could extort anybody anywhere in the world if they're caught in this honey trap, in quotes. And in Jeffrey Epstein's building, they showed all these monitors. He had monitors and cameras in every single room, including toilets and bathrooms of the whole house. So he was basically monitoring every individual that came into his large mansion in New York, in Manhattan. I think it was Manhattan, that $80 million mansion. You know, there were people coming through all the time, and young women coming through all the time, as if nobody would notice. So he was able to film. Somebody was obviously collecting all that data and probably feeding it back to the Israeli CIA, Mossad, probably feeding it to the CIA in the US, and the FBI and all of that, and so that they all had these ways of manipulating figures. There was a fellow, I'm getting off this actual review of this documentary, but it just makes me think of these things. There was this fellow who was a journalist in the UK, and he said that he went along to one of Jeffrey Epstein's parties, and not long after he arrived there, somebody came up to him and asked him, would you like a massage? And he was looking around and he could see all these very, very young women, and young, you know, very young, not as in, they didn't look necessarily like children, but he could see that they were very young. I don't know if they were dressed up to make them look older. But he immediately thought about the whole honey trap thing, the whole Russian thing of entrapping people, and he just thought, he just immediately thought, wow, this is something else, you know. And I would say that because he was not necessarily a well-known journalist, but he was a journalist, I would say that if that group, if Epstein and his associates could entrap anybody, any media person or whatever, and film them getting massages or sexual, engaged in sex with these minors and children, that you know, they can use that in some ways to get them to write a favorable story and so forth. And interestingly, when Vanity Fair in New York, one of the writers wanted to do a story on Jeffrey Epstein. This is before anything was known about him by Vanity Fair. They didn't know that he was a pedophile. And so this journalist decided to do a story on him, and somebody said to her, you should interview these two women. They have an interesting story to tell about him. And that happened to be Maria Farmer and her sister, who were both had been victims of Jeffrey Epstein. And so she did interview them, and then she realized it was a much, much bigger story. And so she said to her boss, she put these two women's accounts into this piece, and apparently her boss, then a severed cat's head was left in his backyard, and a bullet left on his front step. And he changed his mind and said, no, we can't put these two women's accounts in here. And he made an excuse that it was because they didn't have the legal ability to basically, I guess, cover being sued by Mr. Epstein. That's what he said. And apparently they were receiving a lot of sort of attention by various people outside of various people saying, you don't want to do this story, and that sort of thing. So there were veiled threats, and then more obvious threats like the severed cat's head and the bullet on the step, that kind of thing. And so they abandoned that. So it's almost like the mafia, really, and there'd be so many people that would have an interest in that story not going forward, that it could be any one of many powerful figures that could arrange something like that. And it made somebody like Maria Farmer, I think that's her name, I'm sorry if I've got the wrong name, but Maria Farmer, it made her life living hell, because she changed her name, she had to move places, and Ghislane Maxwell would keep finding her, and then basically sort of saying, you'll never ever be able to get anywhere in life, because, you know, basically she had told the FBI about Jeffrey Epstein and what happened. So it's one of those, like a mafia type almost thing, almost like the mafia, where there's these threats that come through, and people are harassed for years later for giving up information about him. So that probably explains why there's so many people that haven't come forward still, because they probably know that there are a lot of people who it goes way beyond Jeffrey Epstein. There's a lot of people that don't want people, victims and survivors, to talk, and that's what makes somebody like Virginia Giuffre and those two farmer sisters, and I think somebody called Shauna, but I can't be sure. She lives in Spain now. Those various women are really very heroic, very brave and courageous to be able to come out, and because it is a very, very powerful, obviously a very powerfully run sex trafficking ring globally. And back to, you know, the recruiting, it was like a sex pyramid where all the different girls would recruit, one girl would recruit 5 other girls, and those girls would recruit 5 other girls, each one of them. So it became this huge thing, and it would just go on like that. It's truly incredible, and it just shows that he had honed that skill of grooming and basically surprising young girls when they were there. You know, basically another form of poverty draft in a way, like the United States military is a poverty draft, and this is a poverty draft of a different kind, where you target young girls at high schools where they've got a broken family and they've got a poor background, or they're looking for some sort of father figure, or they're looking for some security or something. And he knew exactly where to go to find that, and he never did it himself. He got the young girls that he sexually abused, he would then get them to do it. So it's really sad. And then there was, you know, one of the girls there felt terrible that she had recruited probably 100 other girls. So they all went through awful things. So it must have been a sexual trafficking pyramid scheme. And then, of course, some of them would be taken to Jeffrey Epstein's island. I hope you don't mind, but I'm just going to pick out some interesting bits of this that I wanted to just comment on. A technology guy who went there about 10 times to Jeffrey Epstein's island. Jeffrey Epstein had his own, and his island was in the Caribbean. This technician guy who was servicing the tower, which was sort of an encrypted kind of a private telecommunications tower. He serviced that tower about 100 times, and this guy who was servicing the pool said to him one day, "How do you feel about all these younger women, young girls, being on this island? Like, you know, how can you work here when you are aware of that?" And he said, "Would you allow your own children, like if his children, I know, were, they were young girls just like these girls that were being trafficked." He said, "Would you allow your young children anywhere near Jeffrey Epstein?" And he thought to himself, "I wouldn't let my children 5 miles within Jeffrey Epstein." And so he quit the next day. And what I find interesting about this is, why did that man, who also, he should be asking himself that, why on earth is he working on that island? But who knows, he might have been a child sex trafficked person himself, and he had nothing else that he thought he could do to make money, and so he just continued working there after he was brought there. Who knows? I don't know what the story is there, but a lot of employees wouldn't talk about Jeffrey Epstein because I think they were afraid. But I was thinking, why does that man have to bring that up to the technician and make it a point about his own children? Why couldn't that technician just think, this is dreadful what's happening to these young girls? I mean, why does it always have to be, what if it was your sister or your daughter and stuff? I find it very odd that people have to have that brought to their attention. Why can't they just think, but it's other people's daughters and children, other people's, like they're just people. Why does it have to be associated with my family? To, using it as a comparison, like as an example, for somebody to act. So I find that very strange, and you see it often. You see often when women are being assaulted or raped or whatever, somebody will say, "I just thought of that if it was my mother or my daughter or my sister." And I think, why does it have to be your family before you think why do you have to think of it in that way before you think, well, this is awful? We You know, we're all part of this human family, and we don't want anybody to have to go through this, because it ruins lives. Some of these women, well, they all carry around this awful experience, and they have to deal with it every day of their life. And some deal with it better than others, and some have not dealt with it well at all. And who knows, there are probably many who kill themselves or even were killed by this trafficking group, because why not? Who's going to notice some of these poor children? You know, these poor children maybe from all over the globe that are flown in to various rich people's places and used as sex slaves or whatever. Who's going to miss them? So there are probably, I mean, I've heard that said before, that some of those young women have thought that there's possibly there's possibly children that were killed. And I wouldn't even be surprised if, because there's no mention of any people, any young girls who had experiences with Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton was on the Lolita Express, which is one of Jeffrey Epstein's private planes that went regularly to his island. Bill Clinton went to his island like 26 times. It's on the flight logbooks. Bill Clinton was seen by the technician a couple of times, once in Jeffrey Epstein's house on the island. Now, nobody in this documentary said they saw Bill Clinton having sex with minors, but why would Bill Clinton, wouldn't he notice that there's all these young girls on the island? Doesn't that seem really inappropriate? And so I can't believe that he went on that plane 26 times and not have done something inappropriate with any of those girls. I really don't. And I sometimes wonder what happened to those young girls that he possibly had sexually assaulted. I'm talking about Bill Clinton now. What if he did do that? What has happened to those girls, or are they too afraid to come forward? But it just seems very strange to me. I'm not saying he did do anything. I'm not saying Bill Clinton did engage in sex with minors there. Did sexually assault minors, rather. I'm not saying that, but I wonder if one has to wonder why somebody would go to that island, which obviously has young women running around all the time on that island. Why would somebody in that position go to that island 26 times? It's just, it seems very strange to me. And also without his wife, Hillary Clinton. That was an interesting thing. And I mean, Virginia Guffey said there were people that went to that island that weren't involved in sex, weren't involved in the with minors. They weren't sexually assaulting minors. But the interesting thing too is when Jeffrey Epstein, after he served his 13-month sentence in that first bout of when he was caught and given that sweetheart deal, then people like Woody Allen and all sorts of celebrities, everything just seemed to go back to normal, and people were knocking about with him, including Prince Andrew, and that's where Prince Andrew got into lots of trouble. He obviously isn't very bright, and this technician said that he actually saw Prince Andrew grinding himself against what turned out to be Virginia Guffey when she was very young and was on this island. And so Virginia Guffey had a few experiences with Prince Andrew. And of course, if you've seen that train wreck of an interview that Prince Andrew did with the BBC, you'll see that it's just so bad that you can see that he's guilty as all get up, and and that's why he's had to step down from his royal duties, because he really exposed himself and just made it so much worse than it already was. So yes, he definitely had sexual relations with underage girls, and Virginia Guffey was one of them, and maybe she was the only one. And he was silly enough to let somebody take a photo of him with Virginia Guffey with his arm around her waist. And he was silly enough to be doing sexual acts out in public on the island. I would say that's probably maybe why Bill Clinton, if Bill Clinton was involved in with minors on that island, he probably did it behind closed doors, and they probably made sure nobody saw him with anybody. And who knows what happened to those young girls, and who knows if those young girls, if they're alive, that they might be too afraid to come forward. And why wouldn't you be with these powerful people? I mean, it's enough for women to come forward when a sexual perpetrator has sexually assaulted them and raped them, and they're not a public figure. It's hard enough for women to come forward then, because often they're people they know. But imagine coming out against, a former president of the United States, because you would be thinking, well, everybody's seen all those movies where if you that you can be knocked off very easily without anybody suspecting anything. You can be, that's what Ghislane Maxwell used to say to Maria Farmer when she would contact her, when Maria Farmer was kind of trying to get away and get away from them. She'd say, well, I know that you walk along that particular highway, something, you should be careful. That kind of talk, basically not actually saying threats, but basically they're implied threats. So I imagine that lots of those young girls, if they even thought about doing something, or it looked like they were doing something, because there was lots of private investigators being involved with Jeffrey Epstein, if any of them even looked like that, they were probably there was probably implied threats, not directly by Ghislane Maxwell, but who knows? We've all seen, a lot of us have probably seen The Sopranos and how they do threats in The Sopranos, so it's probably a little bit like that. So it's interesting. I don't know who funded this Jeffrey Epstein Filthy Rich documentary, because it seems to sort of, it doesn't necessarily imply Donald Trump, that he's done anything, or Bill Clinton, but Donald Trump was friends with Jeffrey Epstein for 15 years and said he was a good guy, and he likes his women. He likes his women on the young side. That's what he said. So I don't believe that Donald Trump didn't know about Jeffrey Epstein and what he was doing. And I also, I would have to strongly suspect that Donald Trump benefited from his acquaintance, his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, benefit in being able to have access to very, very young girls. And that's just speculation. All of this is just speculation, but I don't think that you can hang out with someone for 15 years and not see odd things happening, young girls and all of that. I don't believe you can know somebody that length of time and not have some idea. And apparently how Jeffrey Epstein made his money, a lot of his money was from his associations with, I think it was Leslie Wexner, who owned, one of the things he owned was Victoria's Secret and things like that. So he's a multi-billionaire. And I think there might have been a sort of a Sunset Boulevard type thing going on between Jeffrey Epstein and Leslie Wexner. If you've seen Sunset Boulevard, it's a sort of a very aging movie star who ends up sort of recruiting this young male aspiring actor, and the aspiring actor was basically using the aging star to live the good life and get money, etc. And eventually he ends up dead, but that's a whole other thing. But I think that there might have been a thing happening like that with Leslie Wexner and Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein was using Leslie Wexner, and basically he even indicated that he could get Leslie Wexner to do anything that he wanted him to do. And I think Leslie Wexner gave him lots of money, and I think he even gave him the most expensive apartment in New York, which was that $70 million mansion, or was it 70 million or 100 million, I'm not sure, mansion in Manhattan. Why on earth would you do that? Why on earth would you give somebody something that expensive? And the only thing I can think of is that he either at one point, was having some sort of relationship with him, meaning a sort of an intimate relationship of some kind, or Jeffrey Epstein did him favors with trafficking young girls and boys to him, and his way of repaying him was to give him very big gifts. That was his way of paying it back in a way, or also keep paying him for his silence. And so there's just one of many very wealthy people who probably had a lot to hide, and Jeffrey Epstein knew that, and that's where the ability to manipulate these people comes from. You can even he could probably even have extorted him and said, if you don't give me that apartment or make it worth my while, I'm going to show all these photos and videos. But it's much more, of course, as I mentioned, it's much more than just these individuals. It's obviously a way of entrapping anybody who has any sort of sway over public opinion or politics, foreign policy, or whatever. Politicians and media and business people, anybody that he could get involved and document their misdeeds, sort of thing, document these sexual assaults or this inappropriateness, to put it mildly, anything that he could do to get that information and then share that with Mossad or the CIA or whatever. And then, of course, on top of that, you have the NSA, who is surveilling the incoming correspondence and phone calls and everything to the US and outgoing, as well as, the sort of phone calls of Angela Merkel and all those different political figures. So you've got the amount of leverage that anybody who's getting fed that information and getting and the photographs and videos, etc., the amount of leverage you would have over so many people with power and so many people with influence would be absolutely staggering. And that's why Jeffrey Epstein was so arrogant and not concerned about whether he was going to be put behind bars for years and years, because he had, as Virginia Giuffre said, he had so much knowledge and evidence of wrongdoing by all these people that there's no way that anybody could really touch him. But that wasn't the case, because just like I think Ghislane Maxwell's father, I think, became a liability in the same way that Jeffrey Epstein became a liability, and Ghislane Maxwell's father, who was also involved in kind of extorting and bad business behavior and everything, he was like suicided, they believe, off the back of his boat. And then Ghislane Maxwell carried on that tradition of the extorting and all of that, and the connections with Mossad, I think, and she got together with Jeffrey Epstein, and they had this bizarre and messed up sort of relationship, which involved pedophilia. It's sad. It's really sad on so many. It's really sad on so many levels. It's sad because in the end, of course, Jeffrey Epstein was, as I said, was killed, probably killed, I'd say, because there was so many reasons, so many people who probably wanted him dead, and he'd actually written up a will 2 days before he was killed, sending the money that he had left, I think it was $500 million, to some offshore thing. And had sort of laid it all out, basically. So I don't know if he knew he was going to be killed or whatever, but he certainly did that in a timely fashion, and certainly made sure that none of the victims / survivors of him could get any money from his estate. So that's a terrible thing to do, really. And on top of that, it was so predictable that he was going to be suicided, kind of thing. But a lot of those women felt like they really never properly got their day in court. They were able to give their story to some extent, even after he suicided or he was killed. They were able to do that in court, but they never got to say that in front of him and have him see and actually acknowledge, even though of course he's a narcissist, so he has no empathy, but still from their side it would have been something that would have been beneficial for them psychologically. So that was stolen from them, and so that's a very sad thing. But it's not surprising that happened. But I think the women that were the survivors of Jeffrey Epstein in this, the ones that were on camera, they seem to be faring okay, some degree, and so that's good to see. And Virginia Giuffre actually lives in my home state, which I'm not living there anymore, but she lives in Queensland, and I think she probably, hopefully, managed to get enough money together to be able to buy some nice place in Queensland, because it looked like she was in a nice area with a lovely beach and everything. So, and she's been very brave coming out, but it just shows that she was she was involved with him and Ghislane Maxwell for a few years, and she, it's almost like a Stockholm syndrome. People don't know how to deal with when they're so young. They don't know how to get away. They don't know how to deal with it. And in some ways, he has things so sewn up, and he's got so many people involved in it that young girls are afraid to get out of it, because they don't, what are they going to do after they get away? They have no qualifications. He promises to pay for education, but it would never come through. And so they have nowhere to go, and so they end up staying because there's luxury there as well, and they're sort of looked after and fed or whatever. And they're getting money from him for sexual favors and all of that. And so, it's like a poverty draft of a different kind, and that's why it's so important in the end, ultimately, that this is why this whole form of neoliberalism and this whole form of government, which has just been oppressing the masses and not giving people what they deserve, which is, free healthcare and free education and a living wage or a federal job guarantee, all those things that people could actually have some sort of equal footing with other people, have social equality, social equity. If that isn't in place, this makes for fertile grounds for young children who are coming from broken homes or poor backgrounds or whatever to end up being recruited by predators like this. And just recently in Australia, there was a pedophile ring broken up. They had a thing that they were doing on the dark web, and they had encrypted messages, and there was probably about 7 or 8 people in Australia have just been arrested recently for this, and there was children as young as 4 years old being sexually assaulted and all sorts of horrific things done to them. And sadly, the internet has made it a lot more easier for pedophiles to organize, sadly. And it's a lot more difficult to catch them. But, there are good things about the internet, and there's bad things, and that's one of them. I'm going to wrap this up now, but I didn't really get to all the different things that I wanted to talk about. Maybe I'll do another part 2 on this, but they were the things that stuck out to me, was how big this ring is, that it's a global thing, that it's a sort of a way of entrapping and manipulating and extorting people that have power, people that have influence, people that have lots of money, and that was the main purpose of all of this. Of course, Jeffrey Epstein was a pedophile, and Ghislane Maxwell was a pedophile too, and she's still running around free. This shows that the sweetheart deal that Jeffrey Epstein got 2005, and that they all sort of washed their hands of him, the FBI and all of that. They didn't want to touch him, and that's why he ended up getting out after that short period of time. They even indicated that he was some sort of government asset. So obviously the government thinks it's fine that the ends justifies the means, that it's okay to ruin the lives of young children if that means you get power over certain people. And then, when he finally was caught, there wasn't a chance of him getting out of that, and he knew it, because he'd become that liability. And who knows who knocked him off? Who knows who was behind it ultimately, or if it was a bunch of different people all together just being happy that happened. Of course, people were happy, including, I'm sure, Donald Trump and the Clintons, for whatever reason. And I'm not saying they were definitely involved in it, in the sex trafficking, but there was a lot of people were friends with him. A very unpleasant character, and Jeffrey Epstein, and very, very unpleasant. And it's very sad that that's how he spent his life. It's very sad that Ghislane Maxwell spent her life that way, and if she'll probably never see the inside of a jail, and she's being protected. She's going from one expensive, wealthy place to another. Could you imagine if Ghislane Maxwell was just your everyday person. I mean, they would have thrown away the key. She'd be in jail and they would have thrown away the key by now. And she's just being allowed to run around and then all those women, the older women who were probably once victims of Jeffrey Epstein, who then became like Ghislane Maxwell, almost like a madam, they were given a sweetheart deal and basically allowed to skip, get free. They didn't see the inside of jail either, and they were procuring young women for Jeffrey Epstein. So 4 of those women just didn't see the inside of a jail cell, and they're off. And I think they brought in a law that basically nobody associated with that whole thing will get prosecuted. It's out in plain sight how messed up that all is. It's just all there for everybody to see that there's obviously powerful people involved in this, and there'll never be justice served for the people involved, and there's so many of them. Everybody who turned a blind eye, everybody who turned away and ignored it and pretended it wasn't happening when they knew it was happening, they should all be charged. They should all be arrested. And there'd be hundreds of them, hundreds and hundreds. Because Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislane Maxwell couldn't do this all by themselves. They had to have a lot of help all over the world, and children being flown here and there, children that can't speak English, 12-year-olds. There'd be a lot of help going on there. It'd be a huge international ring. And all those people, where are they? They're not in jail. Ghislane Maxwell's still running around. So anyway, that's all I'll say. I look forward to hearing Whitney Webb talk about her book when she finally gets it published, and I think it'll be very interesting. And I think she's kind of brave to be doing a book like that too, because she's a very, very good journalist, and I think it's going to be very interesting, and she'll probably do a deep dive into the whole thing, and it'll be much, much more murky and muddy and awful than probably we could ever imagine. So anyway, thanks for watching. My name is Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Till next time. Bye for now.